On this episode of the Work in Progress podcast, Vice President of Creative, Brand, and Media at Google, John Zissimos.
In my experience, I think all companies have three cultures. They have the one they have the one they say they have, and they have the one where a few like-minded, great employees are trying desperately to create.
And Editor-in-Chief of Workspan, Dan Cafaro.
It's important to inform our audience of how to do their jobs better, but it's also to get people to think differently than what they might have done in the past.
Plus, discussion, insight, and more. Work in Progress starts now.
Live on tape, Work in Progress, a World at Work podcast about work, life, and everything in between, with award-winning radio host Tom Alexander and Workspan's Not Safe for Work columnist Charles Epstein. Here are your hosts, Tom and Charles.
It was, in fact, it just celebrated the 50th anniversary of 2001.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
And I
right.
have the movie poster, which we were just sort of, ogling over.
Your hosts, Tom and Charles. Fellas. Oh, fellas.
Oh, I'm sorry, Charles. You know what? It's showtime. Showtime. We got to get rolling here. My name is Tom Alexander, and he's Charles Epstein.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah, here it is, the maiden edition of Work in Progress, Charles. And now, how would you describe Work in Progress?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, as the name implies, we're basically just winging it and assume it will eventually gel into something people will recognize as a podcast. Actually, seriously, the idea sprang from my Not Safe for Work column that runs in Workspan, which is basically skewed, counterintuitive, some would argue ridiculous takes on things like AI, open enrollment, wellness apps, Trump obsession disorder, which you and I, of course, thankfully are immune to.
Yeah, TOD. Yeah. Right.
Precisely.
Yeah, TOD, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we thought we'd take that approach or spirit and put it in handy podcast form.
So what we're talking about is a sort of take it with you podcast, a kind of on-the-go benefits, rewards, HR professional, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Okay.
Something you just put in your pocket and you're ready to go.
I see. So we'll include phone interviews with people in the field, right? Practitioners, brokers, vendors, and some people outside of the field, including prominent business execs, execs from the world of sports, media, entertainment, and so on, as well as entertainers and athletes themselves who lend perspective on teamwork. Teamwork's key here, motivation, and day-to-day challenges as human beings in the public eye.
Yes, and we'll also get regular check-ins from our friends and colleagues at World at Work Global Headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona, and from various highly strategic locations around the country.
Right, that's great. Now, we also have recurring features such as HR horror stories because, Charles, let's face it, you can't spell horror without HR.
True.
And if you have your own HR horror story, by all means, send it in because we're all ears here. You can go to the Work in Progress page on the World at Work site for details.
Great. Yeah, I'm also looking forward to Critics Corner, in which we'll have an HR professional, an executive, an IO psychologist, someone like that, on to review a movie or novel or a TV show from their professional perspective.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, Tom, but I've always thought it would be hilarious to have an expert on pay equity review Wolf of Wall Street or to review The Sopranos from a succession planning standpoint.
Yeah, that would be nice. Yes, Glengarry Glen Ross from the perspective of an EAP counselor.
Yes, put that coffee down.
Put
that coffee down.
Put that coffee down.
Put that coffee down. Coffee is for counselors.
Yes, it is. Right. Yeah. Or Game of Thrones reviewed by a mindfulness coach.
Yes, endless possibilities.
Yeah, certainly endless. To kick things off, in the next segment, we'll be joined by Workspan's Editor-in-Chief Dan Cafaro. And a little later, we'll be speaking with John Zissimos, VP of Creative, Brand, and Media at Google. Power-packed show, Charles.
Indeed, and it seems that our maiden pod has kind of a Sunbelt theme. First, we'll be going out to Dan in Phoenix and John in San Francisco. And of course, we're recording this from an undisclosed location in South Florida. America's most abundant source of citrus fruit, retirement communities, and stories, as we know.
Yeah.
So bizarre, they can only have happened here.
Only possibly have happened here. And there's this expression in politics: if you're explaining, you're losing.
Yes.
So I'm not going to even try explaining. I'm just going to just say to our listeners, for the record, don't look at me. I'm a Philly guy. By way of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I've just lived here for the past 20 plus years.
Same. I'm from New York and still have my New York phone number, so you know.
Oh, yeah.
So when you hear a nutty Florida man story, I got nothing to do with any of this. You know, you take several years worth of tabloids, steep them in the Everglades for a month or two. This is what you wind up with. Industrial strength crazy.
Yeah, exactly. I guess we could say in today's parlance, we're recusing ourselves.
Yes.
That would be, I guess of any. Though in our defense, most of that comes from up north and around the Panhandle, mostly.
Mostly. But more importantly, it's a land of cars that drive themselves. You know, anytime I say this, people either get it or they haven't spent any quality time in South Florida. Here you'll find yourself behind a car, usually a large high-end sedan that's creeping along so slowly that driving and texting is actually mandatory. So it doesn't appear, it just doesn't appear that anyone is in the front seat driving until you pull up alongside and see some elderly person in the front seat, their head barely peeking above the steering wheel.
Yeah, like pants in a head, right? Basically. Yeah, living down here could give you the impression that every third person or so is of walker-bearing age.
Yes. Yeah, it probably does give you a little bit of a skewed perspective of, the aging population. And I read in the past 15 years, personal care or financial assistance given to a parent by an adult child has more than tripled, and that number is actually expected to grow. I also saw where something like 85% of retirees said they would rather receive care in their own homes versus 10% who preferred an assisted living facility. I guess the other 5% just want to go on cruises.
Indeed. Yeah.
But, again, as we know, caring for elderly parents, particularly in their homes, presents an even bigger challenge.
Yeah.
Particularly your parents are kind of in denial about their diminished abilities. We had that with my dad.
Yep.
Reached a point where he couldn't really drive his beloved Cadillac. So the whole family we had to band together and come up with a strategy and sort of ease him, past that. It was tough.
Yeah. And that's
actually, here's a fun fact for you.
Yeah.
Counties in Florida and Arizona have the highest percentage of senior citizens in the country. Not a big surprise.
Yeah. No. The sunny destinations, right?
Yeah,
the last thing you need to deal with when you're getting old is inclement weather.
Yes.
I think we're about ready to kick things off. It's a perfect way to introduce our very first guest. It's Workspan's Editor-in-Chief, Dan Cafaro, who is joining us from sunny Phoenix.
Work in Progress will return after these words.
This is your once-a-year opportunity to help put your organization at the forefront of all things total rewards. It's not just the exceptional speakers, or the inspiring content, or the invaluable networking. It's 3 days, jam-packed with what's now and new in HR and what's on the horizon. Register today for the 2019 Total Rewards Conference and Exhibition, May 6th through the 8th in Orlando, Florida. Register today and see you in Orlando. Our guest is Workspan's Editor-in-Chief, Dan Cafaro. He is joining us from sunny Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Tom. Pleasure to be here.
Well, I got to also mention, too, that you're enjoying a new title now, Senior Manager of Digital Media and Publishing as well. Is that correct?
Yes. Don't
Wow.
be fooled by how hoity-toity that sounds. But yes, that's
Well, that's great. That's quite impressive. Please say hello to Charles Epstein.
How are you, Charles?
I'm doing very well. My not safe for work editor. Always happy to hear from you, Dan.
Same here, Charles. You got to tell me what your next pitch is.
Well, maybe another time, because I don't want to get rejected here before a global audience of World at Work people. That would be too much to bear. In any case, yeah, isn't this your second tour at World at Work, Workspan?
It is. It's my second tour with World at Work. Started off in 2000, the first go-around, and we had just changed from the American Compensation Association to World at Work. So, and it was new leadership then, and it's new leadership now. I started off as the journal editor when I first started, and was a contributing editor to Workspan. Used to write articles for Workspan, and then we carved out a book publishing program while I was here, which was a lot of fun, and it actually introduced me to the trade of publishing, sort of the book launching point for me.
Yeah, so you were at World at Work in that role, or what became World at Work, and I know we spoke and you left, there were some entrepreneurial publishing ventures you were pursuing?
Yeah, I've traveled quite a bit and followed my wife around quite a bit, and so her relocation with an employer at the time first brought me to Arizona, and that was how I found World at Work. And then Margene ended up getting a transfer to Rockville, Maryland, which brought us to the D.C. suburbs. And I stayed on with World at Work through the transition and worked from home for about a year as a book editor. And then I had this crazy notion of starting a press, a small press called Atticus Books. And from there, I guess it's all just sort of a fog. I don't know.
But you found your way, you clawed your way through it back to Phoenix.
I did. I somehow made it back to Phoenix after living in this subculture of small press characters and all sorts of loonbirds, if you would. No, it was fun. It was really a good experience. Atticus Books is still out there. It ended up being acquired after 7 years of my ownership, and more or less we had a online review, and we had a small press that was really quite vibrant in producing titles, literary titles.
I'm interested to know, with publishing, I would imagine every day's got to be real different. It seems to me that it would be something that it's just a constant, fluid thing.
It is, yeah. It's a great role for me. It's really dynamic. I like wearing lots of hats.
Yeah.
And I'm a bald guy, so I like wearing lots of hats.
It helps, right?
It does. Especially in the Phoenix Sun. But no, I from an editor standpoint, I enjoy the acquisition side of the business. I really enjoy the assignment side of the business. I was just talking with a freelance writer of ours earlier, and we're just bouncing ideas around. And to me, that's really pure enjoyment. It's really trying to find angles on stories that haven't been approached before, and just there's the day-to-day, of course, tedium of keeping track of things administratively speaking too. So it's not all fun and games, but I do really like the creative side of the business.
Well, I'll tell you, as one of your stable of writers, I have to say, Dan, it's always a lot of fun getting you on the phone and just having a madcap pitch session. That really is a lot of fun, and much appreciated that you giving us this opportunity with this podcast.
Oh, same here. And I think it really just fits well with the new World at Work, if you would. The idea of taking chances and not necessarily worrying about the aftermath, if you would. I think, sometimes that whole experimentation thing and, say your column, for example, it's so different for us, right? It's just, the fact that we could do something that's a little more lighthearted. It's not so much about education or, the typical thing that you would expect from a professional association. It's also some infotainment, and I think it's just, looking at your readers and members as humans, is really what it's about. So I think, I'm hoping to introduce some more of those things in Workspan.
Speaking of that, what do you have on tap in the year ahead?
For an editor to be able to look at workplace issues and not necessarily just the dry stuff, which, of course, there's a very technical side to what we do, and it's important to inform our audience of how to do their jobs better. But it's also to get people to think differently than what they might have done in the past. So in January, we're going to roll out, and certainly this has gotten coverage in the news, artificial intelligence, AI, and the impact of AI on talent management and how people are. Well, one of the things that actually sparked this topic for us as a cover story was what happened with Amazon. And if you're not familiar with it, it was the sexist robot.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah. I mean, it was, just one of those stories which really went mainstream, in fact, viral in a sense. And for us, we, in the past, might have not covered that with that angle in mind. But this really sparked the conversations, and it sparked, how do we go about this from our standpoint, and from a recruitment standpoint and a diversity inclusion standpoint, and also just the straight, will the compensation and benefits profession be impacted by AI? And the answer is clearly yes. It's just a matter of how much and how soon. I think, there's this demonizing of AI in a sense. They're all coming to take our jobs, and that mindset, still exists, and I guess in, part for good reason, but I think part of that is also just the fear of change, and what does that mean about how you as a professional, say in HR or the rewards profession, suddenly you need a whole new skill set that you weren't trained for, and how do you react to that?
Anything else looming?
One of the things that for us, might be more tertiary than we typically would cover, but for sure it's important to society and important to, I think, the advancement of the human race, if you would, is diversity and inclusion. And I mentioned that earlier, and I think it touches us on so many levels. And so what we're doing is we're trying to come at it from several different angles. One of the things which, is of interest to me is ageism in the workplace. We all could be, victims of that in the future. And so how do we address this? And how do we nip this at the bud when you have baby boomers, clearly being, in some cases, just phased out of the workplace? We're looking at it as, there's this marginalized population, and really that's plural populations out there.
Yes.
And so we'd like to tackle it, one population at a time.
Yep.
Whether it be ex-convicts or, poets and songwriters. There's a lot of different employee populations that today, one of the ones that we'll have, and I'm excited to publish in the February issue, is hiring people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Mm-hmm. And really the benefit of that to business, society, and also to just people's their own sense of being able to work side by side with folks and understand that, these are folks who bring a lot to the table.
No doubt. Well, Dan, we really appreciate your time today. Our guest has been Dan Cafaro. He is in Phoenix, Arizona, and he is the Senior Manager of Digital Media and Publishing and Workspan's Editor-in-Chief. We thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, fellow. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to hearing future podcasts.
As the demand for ever more talent increases, the issues of equity become top-level concerns for organizations. Comp teams are creating new playbooks to meet the challenge. For a growing number of organizations, those playbooks include job-based ranges that historically have been too burdensome to implement and maintain. Learn the trends driving adoption and how you can leverage them to attract and retain critical talent in PayScale's latest research. Visit us at payscale.com. That's payscale.com. Joining us today, it is the Vice President of Branding, Media, Marketing at Google, and quite frankly, a dear friend, Mr. John Zissimos. John, welcome.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Going great. It's thanks for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule to join us here on the podcast. I know that you're it's constant travel. It's, I think you need to clone yourself probably in several cases, right?
Yeah, right. Well, sometimes, yeah. It would feel good to have somebody else doing all the traveling so I could stay home with the kids.
Oh, that's good. And say hello to Charles Epstein.
Hey, John.
Hey, Charles, how are you?
I'm doing great. I think the last time we spoke some years ago, you were going over the very scenic Golden Gate Bridge. I don't know what we were talking about, but that image did lodge in my mind. By the way, how long, I know you were with a different organization then. How long have you been with Google?
I've been at Google just this year, so I joined in January, and I'm just coming up to my first year right now at this place, which is an extraordinary company, absolutely magical, and unlike anything I've ever been involved in, and I feel absolutely blessed to be here, I'll tell you that.
Why do you say this?
All these places, and in my experience, it always comes down to one thing, and that's culture. And what is the culture of a company? How does that manifest itself? And, I'll say this. In my experience, I think all companies have three cultures. They have the one they have the one they say they have, and they have the one where a few like-minded, great employees are trying desperately to create.
So the aspirational one.
Yeah. And I think where people get tripped up is that most companies go out there and pretend the one they say they have actually exists. And sometimes the C-level executives actually only know that part because that's where they live, that's where the PR lives, and that's the projection out. And they kind of pretend that they live in this culture that they say they have. And the only time you can actually create a great culture is that when you live in the one you actually have. That's how you can get to the one you want to get to. If you're living in the one you think you have, you never get there. And at Google, they really live in the culture that they have, the one that they created. And any time something comes up, it's such an open, transparent culture where every employee has the right and the ability and the power to speak up in a bunch of different forums, to the point where every Friday, the two co-founders are there in a thing called TGIF, and they stand up and they take questions from anybody and they answer anything. And it's been that kind of amazing culture. So whenever anything comes up that the employees don't like, they speak out, they make changes, and the company moves on. And because of that, it just allows every micro thing that happens within any team to be magical in that way, where, I just want to talk about this. I don't really like what we're doing right now. And here's how I think we can make it better. And I think that's the part of the culture that really works here. And there's a culture here of disagree and commit, or disagree and talk it out and commit. But that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and you talk about other places. A year and a half ago or so, you were at another major Bay Area company that's worldwide, of course, in Salesforce. And that was I'm assuming that was a whole other discipline. Was that a transition at Google? Was it easy, or was it something that you really had to ramp up?
Two totally different cultures, both amazing. I, in many ways, grew up at Salesforce. I matured as a leader. I went from being, I think, a good manager to becoming an actual leader. And before going to Salesforce, I assumed I was a good leader. And in the environment that I was in and the way that I moved and how I acted, but I didn't really realize that I wasn't until I got to Salesforce and became, over time, a great leader. And the way that you're a good leader, I just said I'm a good leader. The only way is you do a 360, or your team actually tells you that you are. You can't actually go out and say you're a great leader. Your team has to tell you that. That's the only way that you know. And doing consistent 360 reviews every year for a very long time now has got me to the place that I am. But I will tell you, at Salesforce, it was a profound moment in time in that diversity and inclusion became such an important topic. And I built a team from 12 people to about 250. And along the way, you don't even know, like if you just go into a place and somebody gives you 250 people to manage, that's a tough task if you haven't done it before.
Sure.
But as you grow a team organically and bring them in and hire them, it kind of sneaks up on you when you learn to lead through that period of time. But we built a team over there that was 50% men, 50% women. That at Salesforce was my greatest accomplishment. The other thing about that is I had the power to go into the tool that paid everybody in terms of salary, in terms of bonuses, in terms of equity, and I could equalize all salaries between men and women. And I will tell you, that was absolutely profound to be able to do that for the team. And I worked on that a couple of years before the company actually did a mandate for that. And then we had a CEO at the time, and Mark Benioff, who he put millions of dollars into the company to equalize all salaries, and he's done that a couple of times. And he made that a priority to elevate women. If you walked into a room and there were 10 men and 2 women in there and it wasn't equalized, you were to walk out. And there were all these things that went in place to really empower women and elevate them and bring them into a company where they could feel psychologically safe. And it was just tremendous to watch a leader do that at a place. And I learned so much. And now I'm bringing it over here, and I've got a new team, much smaller. And I'm looking at all their salaries, and I'm equalizing those things. And I'm empowering our women. I'm looking at diversity and inclusion and all the things that are really important today. And I always start there with people. I put people above the work as a leader. And I do that in a couple of different ways, and for one big reason. One, I set up a whole thing with my team to be family first, and I let people know you have got to have something that is super important to you way above work. And if you have children, that's got to be number one, that you put your families first. Because if you're not first grade at home, you can never be great at work. I've seen that over time. And people can walk out whenever necessary for their children, for their families, for their loved ones. For those people that don't have families or just getting started, what is it outside of work that they love the most? That has to be number one. And the reason that I do that is because work will absolutely disappoint you. There is no doubt sometime during the year you will be profoundly disappointed by work. But if it's not your number one priority, if it's not what drives you, your life, your passions, your ambition, you can subjectively handle that at any time. Because the important thing in your life is your health or your family or your passion. And then you can tackle anything that happens at work subjectively. You don't have to make it personal. And I watch putting that motion in effect with people. I watch them able to succeed over the long term. And that's the most important single thing that I do that has the biggest impact. It also creates the best work.
You say you wanted to bring over some of the things you learned as you evolved as a leader from Salesforce to Google. Did you run into any headwinds? Was there any pushback on any initiative you wanted to put in place?
Not the major ones. No one's going to fight the family first thing. Although my entire team said they never heard anybody talk like that before. I mean, people don't walk into a group and tell them put work number 4. It's your kids, your wife, your health. Work is going to be number 4. That's what I want you to do. But you don't see that happening. And I'm doing it because after all these years, I know out of my own practice that it absolutely creates the best work. It builds the best teams, and it gives that team the feeling that you are empathetic. And to me, empathy is the number one thing all leaders need to have. You don't have that, you're in trouble today. This place tests every aspect of your mind and physical capability at all times. There is not Google. You don't walk into a room to get something to do at Google that's just the average run-of-the-mill thing. It's extraordinary what goes on here. You'll come up with an idea that you think is really good, and you'll go and present it, and they're like, oh, that's good. How are you going to do that globally for every person on Earth? And that's the way this place thinks. Everything here is looked at through the lens of a moonshot. The creative bar is so high, and it's just, everything you've learned, it's a whole other level here, and that is incredibly exhilarating and challenging, and can be incredibly intimidating as well, too.
I have one question for you, though.
Yeah.
Where do I send my resume?
Careers.google.com. I think that's where it is.
Our guest has been John Zissimos. He's the Vice President of Media Creative Marketing at Google. Did I get that title right? I probably paraphrased it, John.
It sounds great. I'd like to have that job.
Okay, all right. Well, you do now. I'm so glad that you came on and joined us today, John.
It's been a great pleasure, and sharing this kind of advice and talking about it is one of the most important things anyone can do today.
You're listening to Work in Progress.
And we're back on Work in Progress along with Charles Epstein. I'm Tom Alexander, and really interesting interviews today. Our guests, our conversations with our guests, both touched on diversity. I mean, that they both brought it up independently was very interesting to me.
They both speak about it with such great passion.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting to talk about this. And it's also interesting coming from John's perspective. You know, Silicon Valley companies have long been grappling with the diversity issue, and according to John, you know, obviously they're making great strides at Google. And it's also interesting, you know, hearing it from John, who's a creative. This is something you might hear or be more apt to hear from an HR person or somebody who's invested in the diversity issue. But John comes at it as a creative, and he comes at it from the standpoint of, you know, the more diverse my team is, the stronger they're going to be. There are going to be a lot more perspectives brought into the mix. And, you know, one of the things that he's drawn to about Google generally is, you know, it's a culture that's nurturing, but it's a culture that also challenges you. So I think all of that sort of bubbles up. Interestingly, they just named the latest 32 Rhodes Scholars winners. 2/3 of them are women. Nearly half of the class are immigrants or first-generation college students.
Yeah.
You know, so it just gives you a sense that, you know, if you have as a goal diversity, you know, chances are, you know, you're going to lower the barriers to people from all backgrounds, ethnicities, genders, and you're just going to get a bigger, better talent pool. Obviously, it's something we've internalized here at Work in Progress. You're a Phillies, Eagles, and Sixers fan. I'm a Mets, Jets, and Knicks fan.
Yes. I'm sorry for you.
Sorry for myself.
No, we have a lot of those things. We're both the byproduct of Ivy dads. Your dad was Columbia. My dad went to Penn. Correct. I'm more in the Poison Ivy League, I think, as more my.
We're discussing at the outset. We're both Kubrick fans.
Yes. I mean, I'm a 2001 guy. You're more of a Clockwork Orange guy.
But we have common ground in Strangelove. We're both huge Strangelove fans.
Big Strangelove guys. Right? Yep, for sure.
You play keyboards in a jazz fusion band.
Yep.
I play tennis, not in a jazz fusion band.
You've once heard of a jazz fusion band. No,
and of course, you're down with Nicki Minaj, and obviously I'm Team Cardi D. So you know
Am I down with Nicki Minaj?
That's what I heard. The rumor mill.
I'm gonna have to go to the sources on that.
Yeah, I think you are. So you know we. From a diversity standpoint, we run the gamut from A to C, at least from A to C.
Yeah.
Maybe A to E.
Yeah, A to E. Alexander Epstein.
Getting back to one of the things that, you know, John said, in addition to diversity, he talked about his evolution as a leader.
Yes.
I thought that was fascinating. What I also thought was interesting was he used the word empathy. Empathy is a key characteristic of a leader. But it also occurred to me as John was talking that self-awareness too. The awareness that it was a process of evolution. Also the awareness that, you know, the old, we'll beat them until morale improves approach to motivation doesn't really work that well. It's something that needs to be more organic. It's more about showing than telling, because just as, you know, as writers, you know, you always want to show more than you do want to tell, because when you show, particularly in the context of leadership, it's not leadership by fiat. It's not leadership because. It's not a declaration. It's, you know, a lived experience, and even a shared lived experience, which is always going to have more impact.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. John is obviously a leader, proponent of all that, and this is the way things are done, and it is evolving, as you said.
And if there's one insight that I've gotten from our maiden podcast,
yes,
I really want to work for Google.
Wow, it does sound like a fun place to work. That's for sure. No question about it. Anyway, speaking of maiden podcast, this is it. We've really had a great time today. Very, very appreciative of our guests coming on and joining us. John Zissimos from Google, Vice President of Media Branding, and also Dan Cafaro from Workspan. And he's the editor-in-chief there, amongst wears many other hats as well. He is Charles Epstein. My name is Tom Alexander. This is Work in Progress. We thank you so much for listening. Have a great day, everyone. So long.
This has been Work in Progress, a World at Work podcast about work, life, and everything in between, with award-winning radio host Tom Alexander and Workspan's Not Safe for Work columnist Charles Epstein. For more, visit worldatwork.org/work-in-progress. That's worldatwork.org/work-in-progress. Join us next week for another edition of Work in Progress.